Welcome everyone to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show, brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Louis Shulman. He is the Director of Growth at Pomp Crypto Jobs and Pomp's course. He is also and this is important, the host of his own podcast. It's the Louis and Kyle Show. So I suggest you definitely check that out on YouTube and elsewhere online. Thank you so much, Louis, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invite, Justin. I appreciate it a lot.
Pleasure's all mine. So my first question is, how did you get interested in Bitcoin?
I'd say the first time I was exposed to it was in my senior year of high school. I was, first time I kind of took an interest in researching investing. I was taking an AP economics course. And for people who don't know how old I am, this is roughly 2017. And the AP economics course finished the course curriculum with a month left of school. So the teacher started shifting gears to just personal finance and investing. And just in researching that was the first time I really found crypto. I purchased just a tiny amount in fall of 17, just kind of during the mania, because I was at that point studying computer science in college, and it was kind of a really hot discussion point with a bunch of freshmen interested in kind of math and computers and making money and all of those things. And then I kind of fell off my radar. I spent 2018 and 2019 almost completely offline. I didn't have any social media accounts. I pretty much just listened to podcasts and read books were kind of my main way of like interacting with thought leadership and consuming the internet. And then fast forward to February of 2020, I signed up as a beta user for Rome Research. And I was early enough to that app where I actually got a one-on-one onboarding call with Connor White Sullivan, who created the app. And, we spoke and he said, with all the things you're telling me about yourself and why you're interested in this app, you're really missing a lot of opportunities being off of Twitter. And so I joined Twitter, discovered people like David Perel and a bunch of these other content creators. And that kind of inspired me to start my own podcast in the technology, investing, entrepreneurship realm. And through that podcast and interviewing a bunch of really intelligent people in those same demographics, I re-encountered Bitcoin and fell into the rabbit hole and began to understand it more deeply than I had in 2017 when I was just a senior in high school. And at that point, I'd had 3 years of computer science education and a business minor and kind of the back end pre-existing beliefs to really contextualize and understand why it was important. And then at the same time, March of 2020, this is when we see the money printer take off. So it's kind of the perfect storm for understanding why Bitcoin matters, being equipped to actually grasp on the technical concepts and why it makes sense and not so quickly dismiss it as a scam. And then through that process, continuing to get more and more curious and then interview more and more people in the Bitcoin space and have the, very fortunate experience through my podcast of kind of a one-on-one orange pilling. Specifically had an interview with Guy Swan, which was really profound for me. He was able to explain things in a really excellent way. And then a series of conversations like that really kind of got me in the rabbit hole.
Are there any other besides Guy Swan, any hosts that you were particularly enlightened by?
Definitely. So I also was fortunate enough to interview David Bailey, who's the CEO of Bitcoin Magazine. This was just a couple of weeks after the Bitcoin conference, which, I attended just a few weeks after my college graduation. At that point, I was pretty certain I wanted to work in the industry. I, had a computer science degree, like I mentioned, and I was like, well, do I go work as a programmer at just any company, or do I close the doors and wait till I get an offer in crypto and in the Bitcoin space specifically? And going to the conference was kind of my litmus test for, are the people in this industry crazy, just like what the people we see online, or like these actually really interesting people? They're sociable, they're intelligent, and they're not just like revolutionary libertarians that want to like destroy society. And going to that conference really validated that some of the voices you see on the internet that make a lot of people dislike Bitcoin, whether or not you agree with them or not, really are such a fringe minority. And that's, I feel like a funny thing to say. But point is, I went to this conference and really liked the people I met, and including David Bailey, and then had him on the podcast. And he was someone who really emphasized to me, one, just again, the importance of the Bitcoin narrative and like the general reasons a lot of us take interest in this from like the macroeconomic perspective. But from a career perspective, he really drilled down into me how there's such a shortage of talent in the space and a shortage of people willing to drop their fiat careers for this space. And you'll rise through the ranks so quickly because if you can develop competency and prove that, you get things done on time and just very basic professional ability, you'll rise up very quickly because so few young and hungry people are making the choice to go in this direction as opposed to just taking the high paying consulting job or the high paying FANG job, et cetera, et cetera. So that was another really profound interview for me that had a big influence on my ability to say no to other good offers I was receiving.
You were at Bitcoin 2021. Can you talk about it?
Oh, yeah. So I attended that event. It was beautiful, sunny Miami, which was a nice break. I came to that event from a few weeks in Las Vegas, Nevada, where I am now and where I'm kind of from. And it was one, first of all, I really liked their attitude about COVID at that point in time. This was one of the huge, large scale conferences, and one of the first large scale conferences in the world since kind of the government started to react in the way that they did to the pandemic. And this conference had the attitude I think kind of every event should have had, which is we're not checking anything. If you're not comfortable with that, don't come. And I thought that was amazing because I'm like, if you're not comfortable with it, don't come, which I think has been a good attitude. So that's kind of like just one ethos I think is really representative of the community about like permissionlessness and, not breaking any rules, just making an opt-in, right? Like we don't force Bitcoin on other people. If you don't like that you have to custody your assets, then like, you don't have to participate in that way. Anyway, I think there are a lot of speakers covering topics that, when you listen to podcasts, you kind of do your own curation. You decide if you're going to play an episode or not when you're listening to something. And same on YouTube. I mean, the algorithms present things to you, but at a conference, there's only one thing happening on the main stage. There's only three stages in general at this conference specifically. So kind of the paradox of choice is slightly removed. And that got me to listen to a lot of topics I'd never really dived into before because I was just not forced, right? But there's three things you can watch right now. And these are those three things. And there's a high probability those were things I did not know a lot about, like Bitcoin adoption in other countries, right? I had a pretty narrow understanding of that until the conference. And then there were these panelists from people from Africa talking about really interesting adoption trends there. Obviously, lots of really great content about the Lightning Network, which I was also pretty much clueless about before the beginning of the conference. It was, very educational. And then I met a ton of people in person I keep in contact with as well. So, can't recommend attending more highly. Bought my ticket to the next one when they put up a coupon code on the main stage at the end of the event.
What are some of the kind of foundational concepts that you, I guess, relate to when it comes to macroeconomics and Bitcoin?
I think one thing that is paramount, I guess, is predictability, right? The predictability of the supply schedule of Bitcoin and its issuance. There was a tweet I saw the other day that I like the way it put things in perspective, that all 21 million Bitcoin have already been created. They just haven't all been discovered yet. Because I think that's kind of an almost more helpful way of explaining it to some people than saying, well, there will only ever be 21 million. And currently there's this many. And over time, the rest will come to like exist. But technically they already all exist. They just haven't all been discovered yet. Whereas, the current macro landscape, we don't know what the future holds in terms of the supply of money and the way it's going to be created and the process for who's going to get created to it. And, we don't know who has privy access to information and what people are going to be able to make decisions on that information that asymmetrically benefit them and asymmetrically hurt everyone else. And I think that's like a pretty toxic system. And we have a lot of evidence for that, why that's a toxic system. And I think it's kind of really upsetting that, a lot of people on the side of the political agenda that oppose Bitcoin for whatever reasons and are on the side of, lifting up poor people and like doing these really great things also are advocating for a continuation of that system. And they talk a lot about income inequality and wealth inequality when they uphold a system of cantillionaires, right? With the cantillionaire effect or Cantillon effect, where the people closest to the money printer in terms of like proximity in the way that money is printed and in terms of information access to when that is going to happen are the ones who have their assets protected, if not like inflated disproportionately. And everyone else who doesn't have that same information and doesn't have that same proximity is like vastly hurt by the effect. And like saying Bitcoin fixes that is not anywhere near like the meme territory of the phrase Bitcoin fixes that. When we talk about Bitcoin fixes this in terms of like, something random that Bitcoin maybe eventually fixes, like, sure. But this is like straight up like white paper, like original discussions, like obvious consequences, or just like, we know when it's going to be issued. Everyone can plan around that. And no one has an unfair advantage. That's like one aspect. I don't know if that answers your question. If there's others, I'm not really sure what else comes to mind, but
I'm sure we could continue down that, but I guess I'm interested. I know you're interested in business kind of generally. Are you interested in like what aspect of business, I guess?
In the Bitcoin world or kind of in?
Let's start with the Bitcoin world and then we'll like broaden out.
Okay. One framework I really like to think about is, the accumulation of leverage, right? How much more can you get done with how much less effort over time? And that's a lot of the reason that I chose kind of my side projects for the past couple of years, even during school and even outside of school have been media creation, which is something I'm sure you understand as well. But with media creation, for example, growing an email list or growing your subscriber base on YouTube or additional subscribers on your podcast app or any other form, or even on social media, any additional, every time I've been writing a weekly newsletter for about a year and a half, almost weekly. And every week, as more and more people join the list, it takes me the same amount of time to write the email. But at the end of my time in the composition process, every time I press the button, it reaches additional amount of people with the same amount of effort as last time. So it's just me hitting the button, but instead of 100 people, it's 150. And over time, instead of 150, it might be 1,000 and 10,000, et cetera. And this is a term that, Naval Ravikant has popularized. I don't know if he created it, but in terms of the permissionless accumulation of leverage. And so that audience leverage is one form of leverage that I think is really interesting to accumulate. And when you have an audience, anytime you present a product to that audience, you can get traction a lot faster than if you didn't already have those distribution channels. And I think Bitcoin is another avenue of permissionless leverage, because another type of leverage that Naval talks about, or anyone else really in business, is that when you have a lot of capital, it's a lot easier to do things, because if you want to start a consumer packaged goods brand, for example, there's a lot of high startup costs to buy the equipment, create initial inventory, et cetera. And what Bitcoin creates is a world where your capital is not at risk of financial censorship. And that's really important for people, because if the business you're going into goes against the mandate of the financial censors, then you might be out of luck, no matter how hard you've worked for the years up until that point. So I like to think about business kind of the abstract concept in terms of the different resources you can accumulate that make the probability of future success increased. And Bitcoin is kind of a additional layer of security on, the capital leverage, or the capital components of leverage. And, I think there's a lot of possible discussion in the future as to ways Bitcoin, and or whether it happens on the Bitcoin blockchain or other blockchains, can provide information security, right? I don't know if a censorship resistant decentralized social media will or will not be built on Bitcoin, but I think Bitcoin paved the way for those discussions to even be happening. So you can also own your list, and your other forms of distribution are not as easily cancelable as well.
I also think in terms particularly of input output. So how can I increase output, especially in a media context, while decreasing input? So one way I might do this is come up with a flagship show like the Gold Silver Bitcoin show, but then this can be edited into 10 to 20 different clips. It can be transcribed and turned into 5 or to 7 different articles, which can then be shopped either to third party publications or just published on a blog or as a press release. Although I think press release are kind of an old school concept and maybe not so relevant to the overarching kind of social media context we live in today. Press release, you got to go through the press, but you don't have to go through the press today, for instance. And now leverage, so quantity. So that entire kind of formula is based on this notion that how do you increase the probability of success? And I think at first, for most startups, the only way in which they can really quantify that at first is and see the results and say, we see a pattern here, is through quantity. The more you post, the more engagement you get.
Yeah. And I think this is kind of a quote from an entrepreneurship author I really like named MJ DeMarco. He's written a couple books, The Millionaire Fastlane, which is a super clickbait title, but a really great book, and a book Unscripted, which is a less clickbait title, an equally great book. And what he always says is, in addition to list building and the amount of attention you get online and the amount of posts you're putting out there, the ultimate arbiter of truth is dollars, right? So that's why a lot of people recommend shadow testing a product with pre-orders and collecting money and then just kind of returning it if things don't transpire. But the ultimate arbiter of truth is people actually giving you money in exchange for the hypothetical offer you make. And so that's a really important way to validate your idea. Because then if you have that validation, you can feel a lot more comfortable taking risk in terms of, maybe using money to accelerate the pace of process by buying ads to drive people to a campaign where, X percentage of people from this audience that matches the people who already did opt in will continue to opt in the future. So I think generating buzz without an offer to test with money as the arbiter, assuming the point of the project is to eventually capitalize, if not on the front end, on the back end, I think is also good. But I mean, in terms of my podcast, since it has been something I do on the side and for fun and for intellectual fulfillment, we don't have any way we've asked people for money directly on the front end quite yet. So I don't want to sound hypocritical when I say that. But people listening, subscribing, continuing to be here, and the growing, to your point, just the accumulation of quantity of audience over time does increase the probability that when we accept an offer, when we have an offer to make, we can reach a much larger number of people with it for free. And that, means lower ad budget, et cetera. And we also kind of have an idea of the profile of person who would become interested.
I feel like, once you've accepted that content is a part of our lives and living public lives will greatly benefit us and is a form of, is where the leverage begins, I suppose, moving forward. If not today, then very closely in the future, I would argue today, here and now, then you've already won as far as I'm concerned when it comes to business. Every view. I post some of these videos and I get like 5 views. And like, I like that. I'm stoked. I'm like, I wonder who these 5 people are. Yeah. I think a lot of people post and at first they don't really see the results that they want to get and they stop. And that's the single leading cause of failure, is stopping at whatever pursuit it is you have. So when it comes to, like, for instance, building a business in terms of brand, let's say you want to build brand. Right now, social media is really that platform. To do so, you don't need to go to the newspaper and spend $80,000 like the New York Times to place an ad. You can go straight to the audience on social media. You don't even need to pay the $400 to $500 or whatever it costs today to get a PR published on Yahoo, because you can go straight to your audience today on social media. And that, I think, is really comes down to sort of I want to talk a little bit about like how Bitcoin plays into the leverage, but do you have any comment on any of the comments I've made so far?
Yeah, I would say the way I conceptualize kind of celebrating those small views, because I completely agree, right? First of all, not all views are created equally. And the way I conceptualize it is increasing the surface area for serendipity, which is just a really fancy way of, like what I was saying, increasing your probability for success. But serendipity is the idea of just, random, unexpected, unpredictable, positive events happening in your life. And the idea of increasing the surface area of that is increasing the amount of different ways in which that could happen, right? The amount of ways that, if you have like a cloud of potential, you increase the size of that cloud and like the amount of, there's more ways people can encounter it. So if you just post a video out and 5 people watch it, each of those 5 people is like an additional vector in which your content could be shared, discovered. Each of those people one of them could become a super fan, and all of a sudden that one view could become 100 views because that person wants to decide that like your podcast is the missing content they've been looking for. And then they choose to binge the rest of your feed and share it. So, I mean, every piece of content does positively contribute to that growing compounding effect. And like you're saying about kind of the cause of failure being stopping, right? I have like a couple things to say on that. There's a very kind of trite quote in the investing world from like, whether it's Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger, but it says, never unnecessarily interrupt compounding, right? That's like the worst thing you can do in a compounding cycle, is to stop it from compounding. And so that's why, ceasing to publish content, does interrupt your compounding, or at least slow it down, which is unfortunate. And one thing I'd say to people is, a lot of people in general, myself included, oftentimes see things binary when they shouldn't. And that kind of leads to poor decision-making. And so I've, discussed my newsletter briefly a minute ago. I've discussed my podcast. Both of those projects, roughly 1.5 years, 2 years old. And for the first maybe like 60 episodes of that podcast, it was every week on Tuesday. Every week on Tuesday, new episode. And then there came a point where, I graduated school. My schedule really changed. I was driving cross country. My co-host was traveling, and we didn't publish an episode for 3 weeks. And, that was a setback. But just because we broke that streak doesn't mean there's still like a gradient of a positive thing to do after that. So like, best case scenario, continue publishing on that weekly cadence, but it still beats quitting to just pick back up, apologize, see what happens, and like let the streak break while continue going. And there's plenty of people on the internet that talk about, consistency is the most important thing in your content. There's another piece of advice from Naval, which says that, all advice cancels to zero, because you can essentially always find a counterexample of someone not following that strategy having equivalent success. So Tim Urban is a content creator who's massively successful and has, as far as I can tell, no predictable cadence to when he publishes, but everything he publishes is absolutely fantastic. And he's just as popular as anyone else because, there's 2 schools of thought, right? There's something that David Perel says, which is you want to have B+ content with A+ consistency. That is a model that's worked for him, that has gotten him to where he is. And I think he's a little humble because I think his content is better than B+. Maybe it's B+ in his mind, but then you have plenty of other people that publish A+ content with no discernible consistency. So as long as you're, in the long timeline, not stopping eventually, it's okay to like fall off and get back on. and it doesn't have to be in a super predictable way. Like avoid doing that, right? But like if that happens, like, oh well.
Certainly. Now, for instance, I'm going to Denver, which I'm ashamed to say on my Bitcoin Maximalist show. So please, everybody, forgive me for that. And I'm wondering, what am I going to do? How am I going to keep the show going? And it's very simple, actually. You know what? I bet Ethereum people have some thoughts about Bitcoin, and I can publish those on this page. I can make a note that episodes will be back when I'm back from Denver, and problems really solved pretty much. I feel like you can address the absence if you anticipate coming back, right? So that at least people just aren't left hanging, wondering if that was the last one.
Yeah, I'd say that. And then also, I mean, I don't know what sorts of commitments you have in your life, but you can also double up, right? And schedule things. You don't have, I'm sitting on 4 unpublished episodes right now for my podcast, just because I did like 5 last week and I'm behind on publishing them. But now I don't have to record any for the next 3 weeks, but it could appear like I do because there's, it's an asynchronous medium, podcasting. This isn't a live show. There's no live audience. We're very minimally discussing current events. So it doesn't necessarily matter if there's an equivalency between when an episode is recorded and when it's published. And I will say as well, in defense of you going to ETH Denver and interviewing those people or just having those conversations in general, the Maxi community might get upset for me for coming in the defense of people like, David Hoffman from Bankless. But if you look at, they have a index fund, a crypto index fund that they recommend people invest in, or they suggest. It's kind of like a Web3, whatever you want to call it, recommended like auto-managed index fund. And it's a third Bitcoin, a third Ethereum, and a third something called the DeFi Pulse Index, which is like a basket of products like Uniswap and Aave and these kind of like decentralized financial services. Point being, these people are like, Maxis are so ready to jump on these guys' throats, and they still tell people that the optimal portfolio in crypto is a third Bitcoin. So, I mean, they're not as bad as you say they are.
Entrepreneurship, what does it mean for you?
Yeah, entrepreneurship means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And, there's like a definition, which is, I mean, one of the easiest definitions is like finding problems, solving those problems, being rewarded for that. And that's like the most base level abstraction. You see an opportunity, you notice a pain point, you come up with a solution for it, and then you sell that solution. That's like what the art is. And, when I say art, I don't mean I have a mastery of that art by any means. I just have some degree of intellectual conceptualization of it. But kind of the motivations for being an entrepreneur, right, are you set the terms for how you go about solving that problem, how you go about being compensated. All of that decision making and all of that autonomy falls on you. Again, like I'm talking about binary outcomes, there are also many, many, many different angles of entrepreneurship. So someone who decides to open a franchise, right, maybe they have a 3 out of 10 flexibility on some of the decision making, right? The brand is inherited, the processes are inherited, the product is inherited, but it's up to them to hire people, put up the financial risk, et cetera, and set their schedules. And then there's, full 10 out of 10 entrepreneurship, not saying which one's better. I'm just saying the degree to which all the autonomy rests in your hands, where you come up with the product, you've identified the problem that's novel and no one else has solved, and you've kind of building every piece from scratch and wearing all of the hats. And that's also an approach to it. But I think like for me, what kind of draws me to it is, again, a lot of these principles are really well articulated by MJ DeMarco in some of those books I mentioned earlier, but it just comes back to like the mathematical properties of leverage, right? So, I mean, if your goal is to have a lot of freedom and autonomy in your life in terms of your schedule and not worrying about spending money, very, very few non-entrepreneurial routes will get you there. Many will get you there eventually, maybe like in your 50s or 60s, but they won't get you there quickly. So like you're not going to earn in very, very few jobs. You're going to, and again, back on the spectrum point, even salespeople could arguably be entrepreneurs, right? They're just finding problems on a micro scale. This person doesn't have the product I sell yet, and that's a problem for them. And I'm going to like bring it to their attention and sell it because again, they have total control on the full, how high their income could go. But with entrepreneurship, you have fully controllable, unlimited leverage. You can pick a market as ever big as you discover, charge however much for your products, create unlimited different SKUs of those products, and decide how much of that money you keep. And that can accelerate the amount of time if done well, right? And this is a lot of ifs because it's a difficult process. And if it was a fully deconstructible science, then it would be repeatable and everyone would do it and there'd be nothing special about it and it wouldn't work because all the problems would be solved, right? There's different nuance and context to every situation for every person trying to do this, which is why you can't just be a 20 times successful entrepreneur over and over again, because there's like an infinite amount of detail in like the real world outside of the realm of theory. But in a traditional earning model where you're not an entrepreneur and you haven't set your own terms, your company that you work for dictates how much you make, dictates to some extent the working parameters of how you approach work, timelines, deadlines, etc. And for a lot of people, that's just not attractive, especially if you want to accelerate the amount of time it takes to reach that point of complete autonomy. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. And so I want to kind of zoom out a little bit here. And you got some New York Yankees memorabilia in the back, right?
I do.
Are you a Yankees fan?
So I'm actually I call this my childhood bedroom because it's where I lived from like 12 to 18, but I'm really not a decorator. I'm kind of like these are just, I mean, I like the Yankees. I've been to a few Yankees games. I don't necessarily have a team I'd say I like better than the Yankees. But I see you have a Cubs hat on. I'm noticing now as well. I My dad was a big Yankees fan. So kind of when you're a child, you kind of inherit a lot of like meaning making from your parents in terms of like what things you care about. Cause like, what do you know is important to care about? Your parents care about something. Therefore you choose to care about that thing. Like this is the type of television they choose to watch. Therefore you like develop some like interest in it as well. And I had a friend of my dad's and my dad and a lot of his friends all work in the casino industry. So they make connections with athletes and kind of end up with memorabilia. And I think that's a Mickey Mantle is the lower one. And the second one is a Sports Illustrated cover. I'm not entirely sure who's on the front. So I'm going to assume it's Derek Jeter talking about, I guess, some year they had a historic comeback. But I think I've had these since when I moved into this house, which was 2011. But baseball's cool. I really enjoy. It's probably my favorite sport to attend in real life. But I think there's kind of like two categories of people. Like I don't want to say like watchers and doers. I feel like that sounds like really self-aggrandizing. I just don't really enjoy watching sports. I prefer to like play a terrible game of baseball with like 9 unathletic people than to like go watch the pros. I'll watch a highlight reel because like, you know, the internet has created the option to like watch the most stimulating pieces of any activity just by like watching the highlight reel. But yeah, I'd rather just like stand in my backyard alone and just like pick up a baseball and swing it with like a friend than like attend a game. I'm just not someone who like gets much of a thrill from watching other people do things.
Awesome. I love that. Okay, so Pomp Crypto Jobs at Pomp Crypto Jobs. What are you seeing in terms of the, I guess, um, worker market? What do people desire? What are people wanting? What's the 35,000-foot view of like the job market and particularly Bitcoin?
Yeah. So I will caveat by saying I've been there for about 3 weeks. So I'm certainly someone who's been studying this closely for 3 weeks, which is very different from anyone who's been studying this for any period longer than 3 weeks. But we have a ton of job openings on the site. There's a lot of great Bitcoin specific companies. Casa is on there. I know you had Jameson Lopp a few days ago on the podcast, a few episodes back. That's a great company. That's a great team. And there's a lot of really interesting roles there. And so that's a company I'd recommend people look out from the site. Spiral, which is Jack Dorsey's kind of offshoot company. They're hiring some Bitcoin engineers. So it really depends. There's kind of like two really opposite, like this is kind of binary. Like I said, binaries are often not the case, but this is kind of the case. A Bitcoin engineer, they want someone who's like had like experience with their hands on Bitcoin, like not just like someone who's bought it on Coinbase and transferred it to a hardware wallet, but I'm talking about someone who's like written code, maybe try to contribute open source code, like deep, like understand stuff at like a real fundamental engineering level. But otherwise in the industry, there are a ton of jobs that will hire people who just are passionate about Bitcoin. Don't you necessarily know a lot yet? Like a lot of these companies are willing to have you come on board and learn once you get started, learn on the job. Like I would not be overly concerned with the like extent of your knowledge in a deep technical level unless you're applying for a technical role. But in almost every other role, at least on the entry level or mid level, if you're talented in your previous career, that kind of signals that you're a smart person capable of learning things, and that's kind of all you need in a lot of these companies. And then showing that you are willing to take the effort to educate yourself on this new subject matter. But there are a ton of roles needed. Like every company, like we've been talking about, right, needs to make noise on social media. So I care to move my Bitcoin to Casa instead of wherever else I have it, right? They need people who understand all of these other non-Bitcoin skills to compete in all of the ways every other business has like needed to compete for all of time. So basically, unless it's like Bitcoin software engineer, Bitcoin compliance specialist, and like you need like all that kind of law context. If you're just like in marketing or customer service or accounting or even like engineering on like just websites and full stack and front end and iOS and mobile, Like if you have the skill set in the fiat context and you're willing to learn about in the crypto/Bitcoin context, I think you'll be a pretty competitive applicant at a lot of these places.
What are you most passionate about when it comes to Bitcoin?
Yeah, I think most passionate is just Bitcoin seems to be a force for good for like I want to focus more on like circumstances where Bitcoin helps people who are already not privileged. I think is something that's really important. Like, so I think, one angle, I kind of have gotten this question a few times and I'm really tempted to take it like the micropayments rabbit hole, because I think that a lot of the Web2 economy was built upon terrible incentive structures. And that's because basically everything had to be subsidized by advertising. It was the only workable solution a lot of these conglomerates came up with to keep the services free to the end users, where the Lightning Network creates, permissionless, essentially virtually fee-free payment options, and could really alleviate a lot of the incentive structure of these previous projects, and fee-free, and then also instant, right? That's like another important condition for that to work. So if, imagine a version of Twitter where you had to pay like a couple sats to post, to retweet, to like, which kind of disincentivizes spam. So like that's really interesting to me. And I think as an intellectual exercise, and in terms of like alleviating, Western man, let's call it, from the burdens of like addictive engineered apps, which like prevent a lot of people from going deep and like reaching their full intellectual potential because they just get sucked into these services throughout the day, which I think is really unfortunate. I think that's awesome. And I think that is like a huge potential to unlock a lot of human capital. But I think like the most important narrative of Bitcoin is banking the unbanked, right? Like letting a much, much larger global audience capture the value of the, fruits of their labor and make that permissionlessly exportable and borderless and not subject to like the random whims of the places in which they live and like arbitrarily decided like value and exchange rates. So I think like that's one of the most important stories. And I think like Alex Gladstein and his work with the HRF is one of the best voices for that cause. But in terms of like, ways Bitcoin affects my immediate life, or at least 2 years ago before financial censorship became apparently tolerable, like last week with the GoFundMe stuff, that the micropayments fixing Web2 incentives is really big, but also just like core Bitcoin promises, right? Like core Bitcoin promises, you can store your wealth in a self-sovereign, uncancelable way. That's like period. Like people don't really need to like over-explain Bitcoin. Like you explain the 2009 Bitcoin thesis, and that's plenty. Like don't overthink it.
With that in mind, do you have anything further to say about micropayments in particular, perhaps how they correlate with banking the unbanked, for instance, or anything in general, really?
I think like the removal of spam from services, right? That's like a huge benefit. And I think, making things pay to play is a really good incentive model, as well as I think a lot of people hate on Web3 ideas that could also be realized with Bitcoin. And like they see this as a, Web3 in like a shitcoin context, and then like think it must be stupid there because of the like source in which it came. And I think that's really short-sighted, because a lot of Web3 is talking about is ways to better align incentives to make certain human coordination activities work better for all parties and increasingly win-win. And since a lot of these blockchains have, they might be like Dinos, right, decentralized in name only, like regardless of that, what that gives them the power of is, excluding Ethereum, is low-cost transactions, micropayments, et cetera. And that's how, these governments things might work. That's how a lot of these like other apps are functioning. And I think that if and when like enough, again, like so many people in Bitcoin are focused on the core problems, right? Just like replacing the financial services architecture with a Bitcoin financial services architecture. And very few people are working on Lightning, and Lightning's pretty much like, in the scheme of things, in the scheme of Bitcoin in general, very, very new. So the people who are having these ideas and kind of were the people who said that, Bitcoin's already won, or I'm not going to work on its mission, have moved to Web3 and haven't really realized that Lightning is a possible tool they could use to solve a lot of these same issues that they're solving with like Polygon or like other blockchains. So I think they'll find their way back. But I think that, I mentioned social media as one example. I think that in general, like content websites. So we mentioned how press releases are decreasingly relevant because the importance of mainstream media is decreasingly relevant. So I think with things like micropayments, and micropayments don't even have to be like smaller fractions of a penny, for example. though the ability to fractionalize payments smaller than a penny does open a new door of like possible use cases for micropayments, because a penny could be too expensive for certain types of transactions that you'd be, sending in mass. But Bitcoin creates, people. So you say like press releases aren't super relevant, but I think that depends how you define press, because if there's an independent creator who has distribution and you can reach them to make your announcement known, which is kind of like the new model people are doing with things, then that's still a great way to like use media to get your message out. And I think that Bitcoin as the compensation technology for these independent creators, being, micropayments, where instead of a Substack that's $5 per month, maybe it's like a per consumption model where you're paying every set, like a couple of sats for every second you're reading the article, and that's like automatically streamed. I think that's a good model. And then again, on the flip side of you paying the creator, there are other times where the creator will pay you for a more healthy advertising model where the people are benefiting. So Bitcoin Magazine, where I worked previously, they have this app called Earn Carrot, which is a really interesting way for companies to incentivize people to perform specific tasks by earning Bitcoin for doing those things. They have all of these articles on the app where you earn 5 sats per article that you read. These are articles you'd read anyway, right? If you're a Bitcoiner, if you're interested in these things. But now instead of, your attention being commoditized by reading the app because all these terrible advertisements are in your face and they're distracting you and they're making you outraged, instead there's no ads and you're getting paid a couple of sats for doing that. So I think for someone who's trying to, force their article upon other people, and I use the word force potentially incorrectly, but for the people who are trying to get their article in front of people who didn't necessarily ask for it, giving the reader micropayments is a really great solution. And then I think for people who are just trying to appreciate someone's work, the reader is asking for the article, but the writer wants compensation. The micropayment could be a good way to facilitate a win-win transaction in that realm as well.
What are some other cool Bitcoin projects like Earn Carrot that you've seen either at Bitcoin Magazine or otherwise?
I think that, what BTC Sessions is doing, if anyone listening to him or anyone has listened to him or is familiar with, he's been putting together a Bitcoin fundraiser for the truckers in Ottawa, Canada. I think I don't know if that's like interesting, right? It's just like Bitcoin is like a wealth management store of value technology, and the traditional store of value technology, i.e. fiat currency, has become a non-workable solution for today's problem, i.e. like financing these truckers. It's not like a novel application to just create a Bitcoin donation center, but it's certainly important, which is again why I'm kind of saying that overthinking Bitcoin beyond all of the value propositions outlined in 2009 is, like I said, overthinking. But that's one I saw recently. That's really interesting to me, and I think really important. I think that Strike has a couple really cool projects in the pipeline. So at Pomp Crypto Jobs, we tragically are not accepting crypto as a payment technology quite yet because there's like some hurdles to doing that, but we'd like to, right? We work with a lot of companies who denominate in crypto, denominate in Bitcoin, and being able to accept Bitcoin would be awesome. And Strike has, I think it's beta access for an API to be able to basically embed Strike in your backend as a replacement to apps like Stripe or as a complement. So I think the work that Strike is doing to make it easier for any developer to use the Lightning Network as their payments backend is really important, and could create a world where those kind of decentralized micropayment type protocols wouldn't require a really, really talented software developer to build. You could just, write import library from Strike and then have all the functionality you needed and the embeds and everything else. So I think, creating tools for people to build with is really important, and Strike's a really good example of doing that.
You've mentioned the GoFundMe trucker convoy topic, financial censorship in particular, a couple of times now. Why is that on your mind?
Well, there's a tweet that said what they're doing with GoFundMe, the banks will be doing in 5 years from now, right? We're seeing times where there's, I hate the word they, because it's like, who are they, right? Give me names. But there are people, unnamed people, who seem to be setting an agenda in terms of like what beliefs are acceptable to have and what beliefs are unacceptable to have. And the people who have those unacceptable beliefs no longer are worthy of access to public spaces like social media platforms, like discussion platforms, like Medium, like just places where people share ideas. If your ideas aren't within the Overton window set by quote, like the they or whoever is making these rules, you just no longer have access. And I think that's a really dangerous precedent. I think that, the probability that the types of dialogue being censored today are so exceptionally dangerous, kind of emphasis on the word exception, in the word exceptionally, that we should throw away rules that have kept a relatively stable functioning society, relatively stable and functioning for 200 years, i.e. Bill of Rights, i.e. freedom of speech. The probability that today's debates are so contentious and dangerous that we think we have more foresight than the founding fathers who like architected this system that has gotten us this far is, I think, like mind-boggling to me. And I think that we're starting to see, the roads be paved for people to come to accept, right? So everything happens gradually, right? Like we give an inch, lose a mile, right? It was just like, okay, well, we removed Donald Trump because whether or not your opinion on the subject or not, the justification was he was responsible for inciting violence, and Twitter has rules clearly stated you can't incite violence. Whether or not you agree with any of that's kind of not relevant. But we said, okay, well, we don't really like that, but they did it and it happened. Oh, well. And then that paved the way for, greater grievances and greater like removals of speech and deplatforming for us to not question because we didn't question it. And gradually they can do more with less questioning, right? It's like the opposite of the type of leverage I was talking about. Like they can be more destructive with less effort. And that's really bad. So like letting the people on the other side accumulate leverage to do destructive things and set harmful precedents. Because right, once precedent is established, it means it's less alarming when something equally bad happens. And that's really troubling. So the reason I bring up financial censorship is we're seeing the inches being conceded right now, right? Like if people are not coming up in arms against GoFundMe, which, on the circles of Twitter I'm in, they are coming up in arms, which is encouraging. But for, people in seeing, the Ottawa police account celebrating this financial censorship, that's really not good. And it's just a matter of time if and when we don't fight against this, that someone who posts something, let's say that promotes vaccine hesitancy, again, regardless of your opinion, I'm just using it as an example, as something that is contentious and is often used as grounds for removal from social media platforms. It's not very difficult to connect the identity of you on your social media account to the identity of your bank account, which is something that has an off button if, your wealth is stored in fiat assets and those fiat assets are governed by a digital account, right? They're not stored in paper fiat assets. They're stored in digital fiat assets. This is pre-CBDC. This is just the status quo. Like, why couldn't they turn that off? They can, right? If you're under investigation from like the FBI, the CIA, or like you've committed some massive federal crime, they freeze your assets. That's the thing that happens. And we're paving a way for that to be acceptable even before you commit a crime, just if you commit a thought crime or if you're potentially accused of committing a thought crime. And I don't want to see a world in which like that proliferates, that accelerates, et cetera. And, Bitcoin fixes that, we hope.
When you see what has gone on some of these major platforms with the censorship of certain opinions, and then also your claim that we'll see big banks start to do what GoFundMe's done, do you foresee a day in which Bitcoiners are censored on some of these major social media platforms?
I mean, we saw it happen, right? Bitcoin Magazine a few weeks ago was removed for YouTube for no particular reason, right? Like, fortunately, I don't totally know how it got resolved. I don't know if it was an issue, but again, I think if Bitcoin didn't create a shitstorm of like press against YouTube for that happening, right? Pomp got removed from YouTube a few weeks ago for unclear reasons. Like, fortunately, we're in like kind of the middle tier of this happening where if you create a big enough stir or your audience is important enough, maybe the decisions are revoked. But as far as I can tell, the grounds for those people being censored was their promotion of Bitcoin. So, I mean, I think we're seeing this already start to happen. And why is that, right? Because Bitcoin is a possible lever that the people hold against the state for retaining control of the sovereignty of their, wealth. And if these institutions, again, from the mandate of they, who we don't know who they are, is to not let that happen, then they're just going to continue to censor them. So I think, we're already seeing this start to happen where people just, the advocacy of Bitcoin is becoming a target, and that's not good. And I don't necessarily have the answer for like what you do about that besides moving the discussion to platforms that don't do that. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible.
Why aren't Bitcoiners moving to some of these other platforms? I suppose they are. I guess Odyssey comes to mind. But generally speaking, Bitcoin Twitter happens on Twitter.
It's tough, man. It's again, we're seeing a lot of parallels where the things that work to our advantage also work against us, just like the leverage analogy for personal business leverage and the leverage analogy for states to be able to remove more and more freedoms with less and less hesitancy just because of like the past precedent. And why Bitcoin's so powerful is its network effects, right? For every time the network grows by like 10x, the strength of the network grows by like 100x or whatever that rule is, or Metcalfe's law, or kind of like any of those generic network law studies or network effect studies and principles. But the network effect of there has to be a critical mass for the alternative to be better. I mean, we do see these things, the splintering happens. I think like a lot of group chats happen off Twitter and places like Telegram and Signal. And that's, I think, a good move. But there just has to be a alternative that it's a bit of a winner take all dynamic, and it's just really difficult to break up the incumbents. I think that we'll see if Twitter's hastening that decline or not based on how they continue to censor people now that Jack's gone. But it's pretty much it's a bit of a chicken and the egg problem. Like, why are people going to leave? I mean, Facebook has been, I don't want to say defeated, but there was a period of time in which all this conversation and like certain groups of people congregated on Facebook until something better came along. I guess the problem is with Twitter, it's got to either get significantly worse where a group of people leaves in like at the same time and all agrees on the same alternative. And then I guess another kind of difficult reason for this is that the tools of production required to spin up a social network have gone down. So right now that like web services are a thing and cloud computing is a thing, which they are not nearly as mature as they are now when Twitter was created. You actually had to have like an intellectual capital edge to build something like that. You had to have talented developers who could build a front end app that was really responsive and did all the work, and the mobile, and also could handle the server load. Now that like anyone can do that pretty easily, like if not in a weekend, clone Twitter and clone the backend functionality and instantly scale to the scale you need, it creates like infinite competitors that aren't necessarily any like at all differentiated from one another. So it actually has to be like somewhat centrally planned which one we'd go to, because there's like there's Getter, which is a Twitter clone, because again it's not that hard to build a Twitter clone because all the infrastructure is now available for like what Twitter does like commercially. And but why choose Getter when I could create the same one in a weekend with like if I paid a couple developers on Upwork? So there's like a splintering in options. So it just has to be, it's just gradual, right? Like there's going to be a winner take all effect at some point if Twitter gets sufficiently bad. But for whatever reason, at least on the topic of Bitcoin, Twitter hasn't gotten sufficiently bad yet. So we haven't left.
If there's one alternative platform like Getter, Gab, Parler, etc., that you would recommend somebody focus on, which one would it be, if any?
I don't have enough to say about this. I've unfortunately also in the camp where
I'll answer my own question.
Yeah, please.
It's Gab. That's the one I would recommend.
GAB.
Yeah, gab.com. It just seems that, for instance, they have their own server architecture, which they're rebuilding. So they control the servers. All right, we're out of time. Thank you so much, Lewis. Is there anything else you want to say before we leave?
No, just thank you, Justin, for having me. If anyone liked things I had to say, they can find my podcast, The Lewis and Kyle Show, by searching for it on any major player or YouTube, etc. And then kind of from there, you can find the rest of the work I do. And if you're looking for a job in crypto or looking to learn sufficient things to improve your attractiveness as an applicant, I'd recommend looking for jobs on Pomp Crypto Jobs and considering taking the course, Pomp's Crypto Academy. But that's all for me. I really appreciate this. It's been a fun chat.
Pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much, Lewis. We've had the honor of sitting down today with Lewis Shulman. He's the director of growth at Pomp Crypto Jobs, as well as Pomp Courses. He also has a podcast. He's a podcast host at the Lewis and Kyle Show. Thank you so much, Lewis, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening.